Record. All right, we made it to Deuteronomy chapter 14, and we are at verse 22, and we just have a little short space there to read, and then we can start with Cindy with John if she's ready. Who would like to read about mine is labeled tithes?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
The giving of tithes. You must set aside a tithe of your crops, 1/10 of all the crops you harvest each year. Bring this tithe to the designated place of worship, the place the Lord your God chooses for his name to be honored, and eat it there in his presence. This applies to your tithes of grain, new wine, olive oil, and the firstborn males of your flocks and herds. Doing this will teach you always to fear the Lord your God. And when the Lord your God blesses you with a good harvest, the place of worship he chooses for his name to be honored might be too far for you to come to bring the tithe. If so, you may sell the tithe portion of your crops and herds, put the money in a pouch, and go to the place the Lord your God has chosen. When you arrive, you may use the money to buy any kind of food you want: cattle, sheep, goats, wine, or other alcoholic drink. Then feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and celebrate with your household. And do not neglect the Levites in your town, for they will receive no allotment of land among you. And at the end of every third year, bring the entire tithe of that year's harvest and store it in the nearest town. Give it to the Levites, who will receive no allotment of land among you, as well as to the foreigners living among you, the orphans, and the widows in your towns, so they can eat and be satisfied. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all your work.
The Amalekites came from Esau. The question Kim had earlier was who were the Amalekites? They came from Esau.
This is actually the defeat of the Amalekites. A-M-E.
Yeah, did it attack the Israelites after they came over?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they came from Esau. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Cindy, whenever you're ready. Or do you want me to go since you just read all that?
I can go.
Okay.
1422, tithe. The tithe, parentheses, literally a tenth, specified in these verses was only that of the agricultural produce which the land would provide. This was a second tithe to be used for the celebration of worship convocations at the sanctuary. In addition to the first tithe mentioned, known as the Levitical tithe, which went to support the priests and Levites who served the people. A third welfare tithe was also offered every 3 years. 1423, eat before the Lord. The tithe was to be taken to the central sanctuary, where the worshipers were to eat a portion in fellowship with the Lord. 1424, if the journey is too long. If certain Israelites live too far from the sanctuary for it to be practical for them to carry their agricultural tithe there, then they could exchange the tithe locally for silver and subsequently convert the money back into substance at the sanctuary. 1428, at the end of every third year. In year 3 and year 6 of the 7-year sabbatical cycle, rather than taking this tithe to the central sanctuary, it was instead stored up within individual cities in the land. This tithe was used to feed the Levites, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, parentheses, foreigner, who lived among the Israelites. And that's it.
Doesn't that sound like our government system today, like tax to take care of the poor, the widows?
Yeah, it really does.
Kathy,
Yes, that's what they did with it.
hmm?
Yes, that's what they did with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it becomes very confusing when they talk about foreigners in the Bible, and I don't know how everybody feels about all of this with the migrants coming through in such great numbers, to our country, but I don't know if it's like we're supposed to welcome them, but I have a hard time with what's going on in our country, and I think because I don't think it's biblically, like, you can't say we're supposed to welcome foreigners and say that's because the Bible says so, because the motive is wrong. It's the motive behind it.
Do you know what Israel does to someone coming across their borders illegally?
No.
They just blow up the vehicle. If a vehicle turns from Syria and comes across Syria's border into Israel, they blow it up. I think the difference is that these people do have an avenue to come here legally. And when they do come here legally, they are taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about someone going through the Sahara Desert, traveling from, like, these towns that were hundreds of miles apart, and they're walking, like, yeah, you would offer an inn, and there would be this trust factor, and you would give them food, and hospitality was like one of the main things that they did then. It was part of the culture. I think people coming illegally across a border and abusing a system is a whole different thing. And the Bible says also, if you don't work, you don't eat. Like,
Yeah.
it's almost like people take it and they take it to the nth degree and then abuse it. Like, I'm not going to go to Russia and have them take care of me, but I can go to Russia legally and get a job there and be a healthy participating citizen.
Well, it's just like our welfare system too. Like,
Mhm.
I feel like it's
Well,
it's hard.
and that's a prime example there too. If the church was doing what the church was supposed to be doing, we would have families together taking care of each other. And if we did that, then how much would there actually, and if everybody's working and contributing like you would in a kibbutz in Israel, if we were all doing that, how many welfare people would you have?
Well, and people also purposefully choosing not to work just because there is a system out there that they can manipulate. I mean, it's all in the motive. Like, that's not right. That's not what God intended, I think. So
Yeah.
it just gets confusing.
I think
And
all things start
sometimes
out with good intentions and then end up someone figures out how to abuse it.
our welfare system is generational.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is 22 to 29, a generous people. When we studied Deuteronomy 12, we learned that God commanded his people to give 10% of their produce, grains, fruits, vegetables, and animals, to him as an act of worship and expression of gratitude for his blessing. Every year, each family had to go to the sanctuary with their tithes, enjoy a feast there, and share the tithe with the Levites, who in turn would share it with the priests. And there's a reference to Numbers.
What is that Numbers reference?
18, 20 to 32.
Thank you.
But Moses repeated this commandment because when it comes to giving to the Lord, some people need more than one reminder. And then there's a reference to 2 Corinthians. The people of Israel were to be generous with tithes and offerings because the Lord had been generous with them. Each time they brought their tithes and gifts to the sanctuary and enjoyed a Thanksgiving feast, it would teach them to fear the Lord. Because if the Lord hadn't blessed them, they would have nothing to eat and nothing to give. As David said, everything we give to God first comes from his hand and it all belongs to him. And there's a reference to 1 Chronicles. When we cease to fear God and fail to appreciate his bountiful provision, we become proud and start to take his blessings for granted. Then the Lord has to discipline us to remind us that he is the giver of every gift. Every third year, the people were to give the Lord a second tithe, which remained in their towns and was used to feed the Levites and the needy people in the land, especially the widows and orphans. The Levites served at the sanctuary, but were scattered throughout Israel. If the people of Israel demonstrated concern for the needs of others, God would bless their labors and enable them to give more. Our Lord promised, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom." And that's in Luke. He who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And that's in 2 Corinthians.
What's that address?
2 Corinthians 9:6.
Thank you.
As Christians enjoying the blessings of God's grace, we ought to do far more than the Jews who lived in the dispensation of the Mosaic law. The New Testament doesn't command us how much we should give, but it does urge us to give in proportion to the blessings we have received from the Lord. And you have references to 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians there. The calculating Christian will always be the loser. The generous Christian will enjoy blessings of God. However, Christian industrialist R.G. Leitner, however you say it, used to warn, if you give because it pays, it won't pay. Our motive must always be to please God and glorify him.
Oh, I like that. If you give
because it pays, it won't pay.
Okay.
And that's it for that section.
Mine's pretty short. It says the laws of the tithe or tenth were another way of reminding the Israelites that everything they had came from God's gracious hand. They were to bring their tithes from their crops and livestock to the central sanctuary and eat part of them in a communal meal of rejoicing before the Lord. Part of the uneaten tithe provided for the needs of the Levites. Every third year, the entire tithe was stored away for the Levite, the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. If the Israelites were faithful in this way, the Lord would bless them in all the work of their hands. God's kingdom agenda for his people's money is the opposite of the world's advice. According to the world, hoarding our money leads to prosperity, but God says that giving is the way of blessing. God does not call us to give generously to him so that he can make us rich. However, that's the so-called prosperity gospel, which only results in prosperity for the preachers. Giving to God first is crucial because it shows how much you value him, and it expresses your faith in his ability and willingness to provide for you. When Israel gave the Lord their tithe, they were not saying that 10% belonged to God while other 90% belonged to them. Instead, giving a tenth to God was their way of acknowledging that everything they had was from him. Giving to God is a test of our faith. Israel lived in an agrarian or agricultural society, so the people were dependent on their harvest to survive. When they gave God the first portion of their crops, they were trusting him to bless and provide for their needs so that they could feed their families and be charitable to others. The Lord calls followers of Jesus to put this principle into practice today. Any thoughts before we move on to 15? I think we, from the health, am I allowed to use that word? I'm not sure what word I'm not allowed to use. But I think that our farming practices today could learn from this because they rested the land every 7th year. They didn't plant so that the land could recover. And as you see, I'm drinking my dirt. Because we don't do that, and because we put a bunch of chemicals on the plants, which does not allow the breakdown of composting to happen on the ground. So our soil is not good and it's not composting well, and we're not getting out of it what we should to be whole. Like, this is smart that they were like, okay, you farm for 6 years and then you let that land rest for the 7th year. You plan ahead, you store up so that you're covered for that 7th year. We, like, our farming practices here, if they did this, our land would have a chance to recover if they also didn't spray the chemicals.
Hey,
Because what
Chrissy,
happens, go ahead.
it's resting now. There's solar panels all over it.
Well, this is true. Yeah, but like the chemicals, what you would have left over in the fields would get plowed back in, and then that stuff would break down and it would compost in the ground and create this beautiful, yummy microbiome. The soil is alive. With the chemicals now, that's not happening.
Well, and the other thing they don't do, they don't plow up the dirt like they used to work it in, so it's refreshing.
Well, it's
You know,
not
they
going to
just
be,
do-
if they're spraying chemicals, it's dead soil.
Right.
So most of what we're eating is dead, even if it's considered organic. I mean, yeah, you can rebuild the soil microbiome, but you'll pay extra for that, but that's why gardening's good. Then you have control of your own soil, but
But the only thing they do is rotate crops from one thing to another from year to year.
yeah,
That's about the only thing they do to,
to change it up. So it's pulling different things out of the dirt.
yeah.
Well, and I have to say, I think it's sad though, that I think some of the farmers are resorting to the solar panel, using their land for that because it's just not profitable for them. Like
Well, and the
They're
government's
kind of-
paying them to not farm too, or the government's paying them to
Yeah.
farm certain things. So, I mean, it all comes down to money. But I'm not saying the farmers, like, I get it. Like, it's a hard job. Farming is a hard
Right.
job and it's not very appreciated.
right.
I don't have any breaks in 15. Do you guys have any?
Mine broke down into 1 through 11 and is lending money, and then 12 through 18 is Hebrew slaves, and then 19 through 23 is firstborn animals.
That was mine.
That's what mine is.
Okay, well, let's go with that then. 12, you say it breaks after 12?
After
After
11.
11. Yeah,
Okay. Let's do that. We can probably get through that today. Would someone like to read that?
I will. Lending money. At the end of every 7th year, there's to be a canceling of all debts. Every creditor shall write paid in full on any promissory note he holds against a fellow Israelite, for the Lord has released everyone from his obligation. This release does not apply to foreigners, in quotes or parentheses. No one will become poor because of this, for the Lord will greatly bless you in the land he is giving you if you obey this command. The only prerequisite for his blessing is that you carefully heed all the commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. He will bless you as he has promised. You shall lend money to many nations, but he will never need to borrow. You shall lend money to many nations, but will never need to borrow. You shall rule many nations, but they shall not rule over you. But if, when you arrive in the land the Lord will give you, there are any among you who are poor, you must not shut your heart or hand against them. You must lend them as much as they need. Beware, don't refuse a loan because the year of debt cancellation is close at hand. If you refuse to make the loan and the needy man cries out to the Lord, it will be counted against you as a sin. You must lend him what he needs and don't moan about it either. For the Lord will prosper you in everything you do because of this. There will always be some among you who are poor. That is why this commandment is necessary. You must lend to them liberally. Well, that kind of goes both ways too, because if you either someone could be thinking, oh man, I don't want to lend this money out. It's like we're 6 years and 6 months into the 7th year, and then I'm never going to get my money back. But the person borrowing the money could also be thinking, I think I'll just go out here and ask someone for some money because I won't have to pay it back. I mean, it goes both ways,
Yeah,
but they
I
didn't.
feel like there's like this social responsibility. Like if I know, Kim, that something happened to you and John and you guys get in a bad way, I'm going to be more than happy to open my bank up to you and say, what do you need? You know, or whatever. Like I think any of us would do that for each other. I think then you have the ones who are parasites on society and choose not to work and choose to exhaust everybody else. You know, like I think there's wisdom that needs to be used there. Because the other thing too is if you have an alien in your, if you have someone coming into your town and they're willing to work, that's different than someone sitting there doing nothing and you're just handing them money.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's everybody else think?
I think so too. I mean, you see people sitting along the road just wanting a handout, and so many times I wonder, okay, why aren't they working? Is there a good reason why they're not working? And that being said, surely there's something other than just sitting there. And have they tried to get help? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But then you don't know what that person's situation is. They're there. I mean,
I think there's responsibility on both sides too. Like, you know what I mean? Like they have a responsibility. Like if if I say, well, my grass needs mowed, so if you're willing to come mow my grass for me, I'll give you $40. And if they're like, no, I don't really want to do that, well, then starve. Like,
Mhm.
I think it's just wisdom. Anyway, are you ready, Cindy?
Yes. 15:1, at the end of every 7 years, grant a release of debts. The sabbatical year was established and described in Exodus 23:10 and 11, and Leviticus 25:1-7,
Wait a minute, Exodus 23.
verses 10 and 11,
Okay,
and Leviticus 25, verses 1-7.
thank you.
However, while these texts stated that in the 7th year the land was to lie fallow without any crops being planted, only here did Moses prescribe a cancellation of debts.
Hmm.
On the basis of verses 9-11, the debt was canceled completely and permanently, not just a cancellation of payment during that year. 15:3, if a foreigner, you may require it. The provision for sabbatical release of debts was not intended for a person who stayed only temporarily in the land. That foreigner was still responsible to pay his debts. 15:4, except when there may be no poor. Idealistically, there was the possibility that poverty would be eradicated in the land. Quotes, for the Lord will greatly bless you in the land. The fullness of that blessing, however, would be contingent on the completeness of Israel's obedience. Thus, verses 4-6 were an encouragement to strive for a reduction of poverty, while at the same time They emphasized the abundance of the provision God would make in the promised land. 15:8, willingly lend him sufficient for his need. The attitude of the Israelites toward the poor in their community was to be one of warmth and generosity. The poor were given whatever was necessary to meet their needs, even with the realization that such, quote, loans would never have to be paid back. 15:11, for the poor will never cease from the land. Realistically, in contrast to verse 4, the disobedience toward the Lord on Israel's part meant that there would always be poor people in the land of Israel. And Jesus repeated this truism in Matthew 26, verse 11. That's it.
Matthew 26, verse 11.
Yes.
Okay.
I think where it said there that there would always be poor people in the land of Israel, I think that goes for anywhere. There's
Mhm.
always going to be poor people due to circumstances beyond their control.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if it's beyond their control, then I think you do help.
Right.
Just think how much richer our storehouses would be if it were just the people that actually needed it. Because I do think, like, if a mama has 5 babies and the man decides to up and leave her, like, she can't go to work. She's not going to be able to pay a babysitter and take care of her children and take care of a home. You know what I mean? Like, and it's not her fault. But then you have some that will have 10 children just so they can be on the system and get their big income tax check. So,
I know whenever we lived in Tyrone, the family that lived up there on the farm that was supposed to be getting out and wouldn't, they were pretty much on the welfare system. And the 2 girls, they both had babies. And Brett would have been a year old, I guess, at that time. And I did get a job at a sewing factory, which I hated. But anyway, she said to me, this one girl said to me, just go get pregnant. You can get money for that. I'm like, okay. So it just goes to show you that some people, that's just their whole attitude. Just,
I think our culture now is so much different too. Like, the culture back then would have been a farming, working culture. Like, you wouldn't have been raising people who sat in front of video games, and like everyone would have had some participation. Like, to not have family, to not have anything would have been I would think, much more rare.
yeah.
Is Worsby long?
No, not for 1 to 11. It's not.
Okay, go ahead.
Little bit of an overview to start. Those who think that it takes a great deal of faith to give God a tithe of their income will probably be shocked when they read this section of the law. Just as every 7th day of the week was set apart for God as the Sabbath day, so every 7th year was to be set apart as a Sabbath year. During that year, the Jews were not to cultivate the land, but allow it to rest. The people would have to trust God to produce the grain, vegetables, and fruits they needed for themselves and for their flocks and herds and farm animals. Every 50th year was the year of Jubilee. When the land lay fallow for another year, it would really take faith on part of people to trust God for what they needed for 2 long years. Verses 1 to 11, the poor debtor. But the Sabbath year involved much more than rest for the land. In Exodus 23, 10 to 11. It also meant canceling debts and setting free the servants who had served for 6 years. Bible students don't agree on whether the entire debt was canceled or just the interest on the loan for that year. Then there's a note here that says the law prohibited Jews from charging interest when they loaned money to fellow Jews. But the NIV margin translates Exodus 22:25, excessive interest. Apparently, this law wasn't obeyed.
Yeah, remember in Isaiah when God really got on the priests because they were taxing the people like 40%, the brothers and sisters, and then the people couldn't pay it back. Remember? And then when they couldn't pay it back, they had to give up their children to be slaves. And this was their own families doing this. So they never had a chance to get out of debt. I think this would also be addressing that type of situation.
Yeah. He shall not require payment from his fellow Israelite. However, they could collect interest from foreigners. Since people weren't getting any income from their land, they wouldn't be able to pay their debts easily. But what was a test of faith for some would be an answer to prayer for the poor and the needy. They were permitted to eat freely from the fields and orchards and were given an extra year to raise money to pay their debts. The seeming contradiction between verse 4, there shall be no poor among you, and verse 11, the poor shall never cease out of the land, is resolved by paying attention to the context. During the Sabbath year, the lenders were obligated to remit the debt or the interest owed by their poor Jewish brothers, unless there were no Jewish poor people who owed them money, and there would be no poor people if. Let me start over. During the Sabbath year, the lenders were obligated to remit the debt or the interest they owed by their poor Jewish brothers, unless there were no Jewish poor people who owed them money, and there would be no poor if the people obeyed God's laws. Any Jewish borrower who was not poor was expected to pay his debts during the 7th year, and the lenders could collect from the foreigners in the land. If a Jewish borrower could afford to pay and didn't, he would be exploiting the person who loaned him the money and defeating one of the purposes of the Sabbath year. The Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee were part of God's wise plan to balance the economic scales in the nation so that the rich could not exploit the poor, or the poor take advantage of the rich. However, the Lord knew that there would always be poor people in the land, and there's references to Matthew, Mark, and John, because Israel would not consistently obey these laws. The nation of Israel would have been the most prosperous nation on earth if they had followed the instructions God gave them, but they rejected his will and adopted the methods of the nations around them. They did not observe the Sabbath year every 7th year, or the Jubilee every 50th year, and there's a reference to Leviticus. And for their
that Leviticus
26, 32 to 45.
26, what?
26, 32 to 45.
Thank you.
And for this failure, they paid a great price. Their 70 years captivity in Babylon gave their land the Sabbath rest that it missed during those years of disobedience. And there's a reference to 2 Chronicles. The Sabbath year was a test of faith, but it was also a test of love. Suppose a poor Jew needed a loan and the Sabbath year was only 2 years away. The borrower would then receive an extra year for paying back the loan, and the loaner would lose the interest for 1 year. If the loaner looked at the loan strictly as a business proposition, he would turn it down. But that's the very attitude the Lord wanted to correct. It wasn't a business proposition, it was a ministry to a brother. If the wealthier Israelite closed his heart and his hand to the needy man, he would hurt his brother and grieve the Lord who had given him all the wealth he had. Therefore, he was to open both his heart and his hand to help his brother, and the Lord would see to it that he was compensated for the generosity.
What was that 2 Chronicles reference?
36, 14 to 21.
36, 14 to 21. Thank you.
And then where I just read where it said the Lord would see to it that he was compensated for his generosity, it has references to, it says see Proverbs, and it's got a bunch of verses, and then Ephesians, 1 Timothy, and 1 John.
I think too, our idea of the needy and someone who's truly needy, like I think there's a distinction there too. Like when we read this and we see needy, we immediately think of, are they really needy? Where this might be, well, I'm sure it is, truly needy people.
I think that usually happens too when a family has been afflicted with, illness or
Mhm.
injury,
Yeah.
and, they just can't overcome it. And, you know, there are circumstances for sure.
Mm-hmm. Was that the end of yours, Kathy?
Yes.
Do you want me to read Tony real quick and then we can be done with this section? Is everybody okay with
Yes.
that?
Yeah.
All right. 15, 1 to 3. The instructions given about, no. Yes. The instructions about giving in, I'm starting at 1, right? My brain just
Yeah.
went, okay. The instructions about giving in 14, 22 through 29 led Moses to a related subject, the 7th or Sabbath year in which debts were canceled. That sounds like an impossible way to run a country to us, but it was part of God's original plan and will for Israel. Though a creditor could collect a debt from a foreigner, he was to forgive what he had lent to his fellow Israelites. This is a reminder that God's kingdom does not operate according to the principles by which the banker downtown conducts business. 4 through 6. If the person would obey these principles of generosity, the Lord would bless them in the land, and he would ensure that there would be no poor among them. Moreover, if they were financially obedient, God would guarantee that Israel would lend to and rule nations, but they would never borrow from or be ruled by those lands, which, by the way, they do live that way. Like they're very wealthy. Sadly, history would show that Israel was unfaithful to God's economic commands, and too often the church similarly fails to exercise biblical justice by taking action that helps the oppressed, transforms communities, and empowers the poor through opportunities. 7 through 11. Moses continued the emphasis on compassion and generosity. God commanded the Israelites to help the poor who were among them. They were not to be hard-hearted or tight-fisted, but God also knew the human heart's tendencies, so he had Moses add a stern warning. If someone realized that the 7th year, the year of canceling debts, was near, and therefore chose not to give to a poor brother in need, that cheapskate would stand guilty in God's eyes. What at first seems a harsh judgment towards someone who hadn't robbed anyone, but had only held on to his own money lest he make a poor investment, boils down to this. God commanded his people to trust him and to be generous. This is an important kingdom principle. Giving to others as God commands is crucial because it shows how much you value him and expresses your faith in his ability and willingness to provide. The Sabbath year, with its debt forgiveness and care for the poor, was not really about financial transactions. It was a test of whether God's people would trust him even when doing so didn't make sense on the ledger. Furthermore, to provide for someone in need is the fulfillment of the second most important commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. Don't suppose that 15:11 contradicts 15:4. Verse 4 was a statement of God's will for his people if they obeyed. Verse 11 is a sad mention of what God knew would become reality because of sin. Thus, he required his people to be generous toward the needy. The end. Any thoughts?
I was just
Well,
thinking here again, we come back to where it said about God always knew that there would always be poor people because they didn't obey.
Mm-hmm.
well, that's at verse 4. It says, however, there should be no poor among you. When you go into this land, there shouldn't be any poor among you. If you follow my plan.
Yeah.
But it is hard in this day and age, like Kathy was saying, to know who really does need and who's playing the game, playing the
Well,
system.
I think when you're in a community though too, and I think this happens, like if you think about the church, like small groups, like we are a small group. If something's happening with Janet, we're gonna know something's happening with Janet, and we would all pitch in to help her. But if Janet chooses to not be connected to the body and Janet's out doing her own thing, and then all of a sudden she's in need And then she wants to come say, well, I have a need. Well, you've not even been a part of the community. You've not contributed to helping anybody. You know what I mean? Like, so like, I think the culture of this time would have been, they were so close knit that they would have taken care of each other. And if they didn't, then it would be like if I don't know, got sick and Cameron and Olivia were like, well, I don't care. Like, take care, you know what I mean? Like, I'm their mom. Like, they should, as family, and because they love me, hopefully. I think there's like that huge dividing factor. And on one of the community pages one time, someone was on there saying, well, I reached out to all these churches and they're just like every other church. They don't give, they don't. And it just got the best of me. I said, so what church do you attend? Where do you serve and give? That they're not helping provide for you. It's like, no, you are using the system. You guys want to just go do what you want to do. And then you think the church that, and then I think
Yeah.
about it from the church's point of view. It's like, if you took care of every single person, the church wouldn't even have any money to do. Like, you have to be a contributing member of your community. And then if you were in need, people would know.
Yeah, I was in a church when there was a lady, she worked when, sort of like when she felt like it. She did have some issues, but so did everybody else. But she wouldn't come to church, and then she would start to come for a couple Sundays, and it was about the next Sunday, then she was asking for money.
Yep.
And it came to a point that every time they seen her come back, they knew what was coming up, and they just finally told her that we can't do it.
I have
Because
friends.
that's all she was doing.
Yep. They're divorced now, but their house payment was $1,400, which I don't care, but it's like the girl made like 130 to 150,000 a year. And they had not made their house payment, and their house payment was getting ready to be their house was getting ready to be taken from them. And they did not attend church. They started attending church somewhere, and then they went to the pastor and needed money for their house payment, and the church didn't question it. And she was late picking up her money that day because she had gone to get her nails done.
Ah,
Like, use wisdom. God says to help hand up, not make them our responsibility.
And I don't give to a lot. You know, you get a lot of stuff in the mail and advertisements on TV. And I guess I'm just not a trusting soul anymore. I mean, you know, we support compassion, but I really don't even give them any extra, because if I have any extra money to give, I'm sorry, I'm giving it to Mount Olivet.
Yeah.
That's where my heart is.
We do too. And you know, if I'm connected to someone's in need and I know their need, I'll help. But
and there are some good things out there, but how do you know that that's where the money's going?
well, and some of them
It's in
start
somebody's
really,
pocket.
some of them start out good and then end up not being good. You
Yeah.
know what I mean, like, people get greedy. So you just have to be very discerning in the Holy Spirit too. Like, I have had people that were holding signs that the Holy Spirit has convicted me to give. But if he doesn't convict me to give, I don't.
Well, that's like, I think Caitlin, I don't know, she was at Ocean City or someplace and bought some homeless guy a McDonald's meal or something. He threw it away.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we were in Jamaica, Stan said, don't give nobody any money. Buy him a pack of crackers and a Coke. Don't be giving them money. And it's sad that we have to think like that.
Mm-hmm. But again, if they're connected to a group somehow, then those people would know that they were truly in need and would help them. Anyway, this concludes the reading of God's word for today. We'll pick back
Okay.
up tomorrow morning, chapter 15, verse 12.
Thank you.
Yep, love you guys. See some of you
Bye-bye.
tonight.